Okay, good evening, everyone. Sorry, this has been a crazy week, and so I am just getting these lectures up. And the first one, I thought I would start with Lillian Stavely. You'll see that the PowerPoint is linked to Moodle through a Dropbox account. And so Lillian Stavely is a very interesting character. She was a 19th century English woman, a woman of privilege, not necessarily someone that you would expect to have a profound spiritual life. She was not cloistered, she's not a nun, she is a Protestant, she's actually descended from the Huguenots that we will talk about. So she is descended from the French Protestants, but she lived in England. So she became a Church of England person. And she was never, at one point in time in her life, she was an atheist. So she was not a lifelong Christian. She was just not really someone that you would expect to become a great mystic and spiritual leader. But she published these books that were quite popular during their day, and you're reading one of them. And I apologize that, we take the good and the bad with our spiritual leaders and our mystics. And if you take a look at Lillian's, excuse me, I'm sorry. If you take a look at Lillian Stavely's book, she actually, like fairly early on in that book, I forgot that she does this, she equates English people with no spiritual life to savages, and then talks something about African savages, and it's not an appealing chapter at all in her book. And I would be apologizing for assigning it, but it's one of those things where it prompts good discussion. And so I think that, I want you to take a look at it and think through it. And do we throw out everything she has to say just because she was kind of a person of her time? And she, was reflecting what most English people thought. In fact, what I think she was doing was expressing a really countercultural idea that any English person anywhere could be equated with an African. And, the English at this time thought that they were so high and mighty and so much above anyone that just the idea that she's saying that an English person that is not spiritual is basically on the level with an African, in her mind, I know that it sounds terrible to us today, but at the time, I'm sure it was a very countercultural and, maybe even kind of dangerous thing to say, because people couldn't even imagine that any English person could be on that level. So I know that that doesn't really explain or defend it. I just invite your comments. Feel free, have at it. I think that she's still worth reading because she really has a lot of interesting things to say about spiritual life. But I leave that up to you. So let's take a look and learn a little bit about her. So she was, so I'm just following along with the PowerPoint. She was born in 1871, and her maiden name was Baudouin, probably it would have been pronounced, but I'm not exactly sure. She died in 1928. She descended, as I said, from these French Huguenots. They were French nobility. She lived in England but traveled in Europe, and she was very well educated. That does seem to be a theme with these people. Of course, they're well educated enough to write books that we are reading. And so I think that's why we're seeing this constellation of Christian mystics that are well educated. I'm sure there were plenty of mystics that were not well educated. The problem is they didn't go on to write books that we could read, other than Marjorie Kemp, English woman, Middle Ages. I don't think she was very well educated. She actually had an amanuensis. She had someone write for her. But other than Marjorie, I can't think of any of the mystics that were not well educated, in part because we only know of them through their books, and they had to be well educated to write the books. So what about the history of the Huguenots? The Huguenots were French Protestants. They were inspired by Calvin. Protestantism came to France in 1530, and by 1562 there were 2 million Protestants. We don't usually think of France being a Protestant country. And the Huguenots, the word Huguenot was originally a derisive term, right? We often adopt terms that are derisive. And the Edict of Nantes actually accommodated the Protestants, but then the edict was revoked in 1685, and there was a massacre. And so it was a very bloody, just a massacre in France, and these poor people, many of them fled. So roughly 500,000 Huguenots relocated to other Protestant countries, including England, the Dutch Republic, and the colonies, so including the United States. So Stavely's parents, she descended from these Huguenots that had relocated into England. And her parents had clearly they'd done very well in England. They were prosperous. And so they lived this life of leisure and learning and culture. And so with her 2 brothers, she spent winters in Italy, and they had tutors and governesses and attended boarding schools. By the way, I should add that this picture is not Lillian Stavely, the picture that I've depicted on the slide. It is, in fact, just someone of that time period, but it gives you a sense of kind of Lillian Stavely's stature and the way she would have been dressing. And so Lillian was so accomplished, she spoke 4 languages fluently. And she may be the only one that we know of that was a debutante, and then she became a mystic. So of her first ball, Stavely writes, "That night, and oh how often afterwards, I knew the sulging exultation, the intoxication of the joy of life. How often in social life, in brilliant scenes of light and laughter, music and love, I seemed to ride on the crest of a wave in the marvelous glamour of youth." Now, this is interesting because she later finds this crest of a wave in God's love. But in her youth, she's finding it, and it doesn't have anything really to do with God. She says, "I was worshiping the beautiful without giving sufficient thought to him from whom all beauty proceeds. Half a lifetime was to go by before I realized what this habit was leading me, that it was the first step toward the acquirement of all of that most exquisite of all blessings, the gift of the contemplation of God." So in other words, Lillian would go out in nature and just glory in the beauty of nature. And she says, in a way that was wrong, because she wasn't really recognizing the creator, our creator God, who had created this beauty in nature. But at the same time, she says, it was really kind of her first step. This appreciation for nature became a first step toward an appreciation for God, and a gratitude for God, and a love for God. So, but before she reached that stage where she could love God, she had to go in the other direction and become an atheist. And she says, my intelligence said, resign yourself to what is, after all, the truth. Console yourself with the world and material achievements. The heart said, Resignation is impossible, for there is no consolation to the heart without God. I listened to my heart rather than my intelligence, and for 2 terrible years I fought for faith. So prior to this time, she really is in that world of intelligence. And then she spends this time where she thinks maybe she should believe, but she resists it. And so she fights back and forth within herself. And so there's this cartoon that I've included on this slide from 1890, and it kind of gives you a sense of what people were thinking. People were really beginning to recognize free thought and these ideas of investigation and reason and education, humanity, justice, science, virtue, love, liberty, and truth. And so this was really the Enlightenment coming full force here. And that was in contrast to this road of faith, where the people of reason were at this point beginning to kind of mock the road of faith, because they saw the road of faith leading to hypocrisy, ignorance, cruelty, superstition, fraud, decay, and death. So, so you can see where Lillian was, it wasn't that unusual at that time to adopt this position of being more of an atheist. But then in Italy, as she's visiting these temples, she's so moved by the beauty of her surroundings and a longing for her Lord so painfully real that the longing could not be denied. So it's again beauty, I think significantly, that leads her back to faith. And so I think that, it's kind of a Urs von Balthasar approach to theology, is this path of faith leading through beauty. So in 1899, Stavely married General William Cathcart Stavely, and her father was initially opposed to the marriage because Stavely had no money. But her father suffered a heart attack and later died, and Stavely was devastated and ill. And as soon as she got a little bit better, she married the general, and then he left soon thereafter for the Anglo-Boer War. So he was in the Boer War. And so Stavely really begins this life of spirituality. While her husband is away, she's devoted to Christ, she's devoted to God, and she secretly publishes these books, and they're all published anonymously. And her husband of 30 years, they were married 30 years, and he had no idea that she was writing or that she had this spiritual life. And so the books are now beginning to gain critical praise. And so you saw the one scholarly article that I attached that praises Stavely's work. So she really does have some feminist leanings as she, wrote her books. And for instance, she said, "What profound injustice to suffer so much and to receive no recognition whatever, whilst men walk off with all the joys after leading very questionable lives." So, so she's seeing women as being people in this life that suffer a lot and don't get the recognition that they deserve, despite the hardships that they suffer, and that men instead get praised. And that probably, was true back in that time. So one of the things that she sees is she sees the soul as being the feminine. And so again, I think that leads her, it bolsters her kind of feminist position, but it also speaks to this idea of emanation and return, as we just studied in Evelyn Underhill. By the way, she and Evelyn Underhill knew each other. So Stavely and Evelyn Underhill knew of Stavely's writing too. So she says, clothed in the body of either man or woman, the soul is predominantly feminine, the feminine principle beloved of and returning to the eternal masculine of God. And so let's take a break at this point. We're getting to be about 15 minutes. It takes forever for these videos to upload, so I'm going to break this here. Obviously, you've got a much larger PowerPoint, so I don't have to break at the point of the PowerPoint, but we're on slide 15 of the PowerPoint. We're at 15 minutes roughly at the video, so I'll break here. We'll come back in a few minutes.